Welcome to our Theological Institute. We continue our line-by-line study of the Gospel of Matthew. Why are we doing this? Because we know that this Sunday is the last Sunday of Luke, which means that after this Sunday, what are we jumping into? The year of Matthew. Last Sunday of Luke coming up. After that, we'll be reading from the Gospel of Matthew. We have come to chapter 14, which means that as soon as we finish chapter 14 this evening, we're halfway through the Gospel. So tonight we'll see if we can do 14, 15, 16, maybe even probably 17. Shall we, we just go in order? We'll start with chapter 14. John the Baptist is beheaded. This is verses 1 through 12 of chapter 14. For those who are following on Facebook, we're reading the New Revised Standard Version Translation, the NRSV. Deacon Stephen, will you lead us off with chapter 14, verses 1 through 12? John the Baptist beheaded.
At the time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus and said to his two attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him."
So, let's just understand who are the characters in this. Herod is looking at Jesus and saying that Jesus is who?
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist.
How fascinating. Herod knows that he killed John the Baptist. Now he sees that Jesus, this powerful person, and he's like, oh my God, I killed John the Baptist. John the Baptist has now come back from the dead in the form of this guy, Jesus. Deacon Stephen?
Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oath and his dinner guest, he ordered that her request be granted, and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus.
Very famous scene in art where you see John the Baptist's head being served on a platter. Comes back to this story that we find in Matthew chapter 14. How it was that Herod had already imprisoned John. Why? Because John said, "Wait a minute, buddy. I saw you take your brother's wife. You can't do that." Had him in prison. And then according to the story that's left with us, Herodias, the daughter of Herodias, danced so well that he promised her anything, including half his kingdom. And she went back to her mother, and her mother said, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter." She asked for it, and she got it. And that, according to the tradition of Matthew, was how John the Baptist died. Ready for verses 13 through 21. Jordan, Jesus feeds the 5,000.
When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children.
Here in Austin, Texas, there's a nonprofit called Mobile Loaves and Fishes. Where does it get its name? Matthew chapter 14. What's the story? We hear it in all of the Gospels. What a fascinating thing to see which Gospels tell which stories. The multiplication of loaves and fish is something that we hear in all of the Gospels. That Jesus in a solitary place, the people follow him out there. At the end of the day, they say, "Jesus, let's tell these people to go home. We don't have enough food to feed them." Or do they? They take, according to the story, 5 loaves of bread 2 fish, and somehow enough to feed all the people, with 12 baskets of leftovers remaining. Scripture scholars wonder how to interpret this, whether it was a sort of, do we take it literally, that Jesus somehow took his hand over the bread and the fish and they started to multiply like popcorn popping? Or if it's something where in their culture, maybe they didn't want to embarrass anyone by eating the food that they brought with them, so by them sharing the food, it encouraged all the other people to take out the food that they brought with them and share it with others. And by the time they had finished sharing the food that they had taken into the wilderness, into the desert, they had all sorts of food left over. All sorts of ways a person could interpret this, but for the ancient church, again, it was a sign of Jesus' power, that Jesus had this power among the people to be able to feed 5,000 people.
So this is one of the stories that's in all the Gospels?
Uh-huh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. We're ready for Jesus walking on water? Another great story. This is chapter 14, verses 22 through 36. Becky, take it away.
Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and, beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed.
Wow. So, some of the biggest boats in this world are super tankers, which are tons. They weigh tons upon tons. Or aircraft carriers, which weigh tons. Have you ever thought about how it is that an aircraft carrier or a super tanker can float, being that heavy?
Made of metal.
It's because it displaces enough water. So water has this effect on something that if you try to put something into the water is going to push up against it because the water is this high. And so if you put anything into the water, then the water is going to try to push it up and maintain its level. So with a super tanker, you put the super tanker in the water and it's displacing so much water that the water is pushing it up and it stays up because it's displacing that much water. Did you ever notice that you can float on the water? How do you float on the water? You just go on your back and you begin to displace enough water that the water pushes you up to the top of the water. Have you ever tried to stand on water? It doesn't work because the sole of your foot is not displacing enough water. Follow me? The sole of your foot's not displacing enough water, which is why the weight goes down until there's enough of you in the water for the water to push you up. It's the principle of buoyancy. Our ancient ancestors didn't know this principle, and so they created this story of Jesus literally walking on the surface of the water. They had this literal belief that Jesus somehow was able to walk on the water because anything that God can do, Jesus can do. Jesus has power over the water. Jesus has power over nature. And so they came up with this story that's repeated in various Gospels of Jesus walking on the water. Like the other stories, we know Jesus was born Jesus was born in Bethlehem, according to the stories. But then Jesus was raised in Nazareth in the north. There's the Sea of Galilee. And in the stories, remember how it is that even when we studied the Gospel of Luke, Jesus starts over here in Galilee, in Nazareth, but then makes it over to the lake and then crosses the lake. That's what's happening in this story. Finally, in chapter 14, Jesus is crossing the lake, going to a solitary place to pray. His disciples are in the middle of the boat, in the middle of the sea, in the middle of what looks to be a storm, and Jesus walks out to them. Showing, essentially, that Jesus had God's power. Anything, the word that they used was Lord. We use it in all capital letters in the Psalm. Jesus had God's power. Jesus had the Lord's power. God could still the sea, so could Jesus. God had power over the sea. Jesus too. Just walked right on out. Hey guys, how's it going out there? We see after he gets out, the people of Gennesaret then recognize all the good he's doing. Same thing. Everyone comes to him for healing. I just want to touch the hem of his cloak, the tassel of his cloak, and I'll be healed. People of faith flocked to Jesus. Oh, so good. Chapter 14. What a rich chapter in the Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 15, Mario, brings us to verses 1.
That which defiles.
That which defiles. Shall we go all the way through 20, or if you want to take a pause, you pause anywhere, and we'll pass it off to Rudy.
Then the Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, "Why did your disciples break the tradition? Do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what you might have been used in to help their father and mother is devoted to God. They are not to honor the father or mother with it. Thus nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. You hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of the mouth, that is what defiles them. Then the disciples came to Jesus and asked, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this? He replied, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind, the blind, both will fall into a pit. Peter said, explain the parable to us. Are you still so dull? Jesus asked them. Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? Testimony, slander, these are what defile a person. But eating with unwashed hands does not defile them.
So the Pharisees were concerned about hand washing. And Jesus, this is one of those examples where Jesus is pointing to the externals versus the internals. Right? Oh, you're so worried about washing the dirt off your hands. Got no news for you. Maybe you should be thinking about what's inside rather than what's on the outside. If you eat with dirty hands, that is not going to defile you. If you eat pork, this would have been controversial back then. If you eat pork, pork is not going to defile you. Remember back then they had all sorts of rules about what you couldn't eat? Thou shalt not eat pork, thou shalt not eat shrimp, thou shalt not eat catfish. It goes on and on and on. Thou shalt not eat pepperoni pizza, you sinners. The various things that you couldn't eat. Jesus in this is saying, what goes into the mouth is not what defiles a person. The words here in the NRSV is light, and in other translations that we hear at church, it says, what goes into the mouth goes into the stomach and passes into the latrine. If you eat some pork, that pork is not going to defile you. Let me tell you what's going to happen to that pork. You eat the pork, it goes into your stomach, and you know what? The next day, it's no longer in your body. That doesn't defile you. What does defile you? Not what goes into the mouth, but what comes out of the mouth. Give me what's inside your heart. Oh, that's pretty profound. If you don't know what a person is thinking, listen to what they say. Oh, don't you just hate me? Oh, shoot. Tells you what's in their heart. What defiles you is not what goes in. You're so worried about my disciples eating with dirty hands and or thinking about what it is that they're eating? No. What defiles a person is what comes out of them. You Pharisees are blind guides. You're telling people that all these things are important. These things are not important. What happens when a blind person leads another blind person? They end up both falling in the pit. You Pharisees are falling in the pit, and you're taking other people with you. Yikes. With your fixation on the exterior and on all these dietary laws. That's not what defiles a person. What defiles them is what comes from out of the mouth. What comes out of the mouth. What comes out of the heart. Pretty strong words. Questions or comments on what defiles? It ends in verse 19 with all those things that come from the heart. What are the things that defile? For out of the heart comes evil thoughts. Murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. All these things that defile, they don't come from outside and come into you. They come from inside out. Ready for the faith of the Canaanite woman? Rudy, this is chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. The faith of a Canaanite woman.
Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from the vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word, so his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I will send only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment.
What makes this story so significant is that this woman was a Canaanite. She was not Jewish. Back then we had words, you were either Jewish or non-Jewish. You were either Jewish or you were a Gentile. She was a Gentile. Jesus was a Jew. So here we have the story of a Jew talking to a Gentile, thinking that he was sent for Jews. Woman, get out of here. I've been sent to help the Jews. Follow me. And she just wants her daughter to be healed like she's seen him healing everyone else. Hey, Jesus, why don't you heal my daughter like you heal everyone else? Sorry, but I came for the Jews. I love this exclusive picture of Jesus. There are very few stories that show this kind of Jesus who's like, no, I'm not helping you. And this woman, with her faith, Jesus says, I came for the lost sheep of Israel. It's not right to give the children's food to the dogs, right? We only have a certain amount of food. Who am I going to give it to? Am I going to give it to my child, the Jewish people? Or am I going to give it to the dogs, you Canaanites? No, I'm going to give it to the children, to the Jews. And she says, well, Lord, even the crumbs that fall from the table, the dogs will take any crumb that you give me, I'll take it. And Jesus saw her faith and gave her what she wanted. Her daughter was healed. What a picture of Jesus, though, to see Jesus referring to the Canaanite woman and her child as dogs. Right? Why should I give food to the dogs that really belongs to the kids? I'll give you the kids, the Jewish people, not to the dogs, you Canaanites, you Gentiles. Yikes. So we see this change of heart in Jesus, where Jesus sees her faith and gives her what she asks for. What a beautiful story of the Canaanite woman's faith. What a dark story of Jesus. Questions or comments on the faith of the Canaanite woman? That brings us to chapter 15, Gloria. This is verses 29 through 39. Jesus feeds the 4,000. So Jesus just fed 5,000. Now there's going to be another multiplication story of Jesus feeding 4,000. Gloria?
Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, and the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet. And he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And they praised to God of Israel. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, where could we get enough bread in the remote place to feed such a crowd? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples. And they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 baskets full of broken pieces and were left over. The number of those who ate, the 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got into the boat and went to the vicinity of Magadan.
So another multiplication story. This time it's not 5 loaves and 2 fish. This time it's 7 loaves and a few fish. We love the imagery. Where are they doing this? On a mountainside. We know in the ancient mind, anytime you were going up, you were getting closer to God. God was imagined as being in the heavens. So Moses, where did Moses receive the law? Moses went up the mountain. Jesus went up the mountain to preach. The Sermon on the Mount, went up and preached to people. So he was like Moses. Here's another story where Jesus is going up the mountainside, showing his authority, showing his closeness to God. All sorts of people are coming to him to be healed, and he shows compassion for them. These people have been following me for 3 days without anything to eat. What are we going to do about that? 7 loaves, few fish. What we love here is the Eucharistic motif. Do you hear how this resembles what we do at Mass? Jesus took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke the bread, and he gave it to the people. Have you heard words like that before? Last Supper. Jesus took the bread, he blessed the bread, he broke the bread, gave it to his friends and said. So it's this Eucharistic motif that we hear repeated, which is why we often hear stories like this, multiplication, on days in which we celebrate the mystery of the Eucharist, like the solemnity of the body and blood of Christ. You'll hear a story like this. This time not 12 baskets full, but of course remember the symbolism of numbers. We started with 7 loaves, got back 7 baskets of leftovers. How many people do we feed this time? 4,000 men, not counting women and children. Boy, Gloria, that was pretty patriarchal of you. Oh, that's how the story was written. It was written in a male-centered society where only, yikes guys, only the men counted. It's a sad story in retrospect, but the point of those who wrote it was, that was a lot of people. Imagine if every guy, Jesus didn't just feed 4,000 people. We're talking about Jesus feeding what? Maybe 8,000, maybe 10 or 12,000, maybe more, depending on how big the families were. It's a big miracle. It wasn't just 4,000 people.
Being on the mountain, that he would oversee that many people.
That's the image that we have. Yeah. And so, the higher you are, think about how our churches are made. The churches always have steps in the front of the church so that the priest or the bishop is always a little higher.
So you can see it.
That's the image that we have here, right? Of Jesus looking down on all the people. We're not just talking 4,000 people. We're talking like, let's just imagine 8 or 10 or 12,000 or more. It's a big field of people. And they all ate and were satisfied. And that's the point of the story. Jesus nourishes the people. Right, for the next bit, that brings us up to chapter 16 already. Matthew chapter 16, verses 1 through, Heather, do you mind taking us through verse 12? So it's the demand for a sign in the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, "When evening comes, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah." Jesus then left them and went away. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. "Be careful," Jesus said to them. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They discussed this among themselves and said, "It is because we didn't bring any bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "You of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in the bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Wow, so now We're over halfway through the Gospel of Matthew, and so the tension is going to grow. And some of the first tension that we see here is between the Pharisees and the scribes and Jesus. And they're beginning to test him. Hey, we see you doing all these miracles. Give us a sign. Does Jesus give them a sign? Doesn't give them a sign. Says there will be no sign. No sign will be given you except the sign of Jonah. Who is Jonah? Do you remember that story? Jonah? Jonah and the whale?
Yeah.
Oh, have you heard that story before? Jonah was the one who went and preached to the people and said, 3 more days and the city of Nineveh will be destroyed. And it took them 3 days to walk through the city. So imagine this is a really big city. That's what we're led to believe. It takes you 3 days. Of course, 3 is a symbolic number of completeness. It takes you 3 days to walk through the city. Be able to say, in 3 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. Jesus is like, no, you're not going to get a sign. Jonah gave him a sign, and so it could come at any moment. Read the signs of the times, Jesus is saying. Then he switches into this description of yeast, which is fascinating, because imagine for a moment not knowing what yeast is. We all know what yeast is now. You can go to the supermarket and buy a packet of yeast. It looks like powder. You mix up some flour and some water. You dump this. Imagine. I don't know about y'all, but I just thought Becky was a sorceress. How did she do that? Which is why this yeast was something that we were a little scared of in the ancient times. Once a year, we would sweep our entire homes to try to get all the yeast out. And that was when we celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Let's sweep out all the old yeast. And Jesus is going to talk about that in different points in the gospel. Get rid of the old yeast. And then it's like beginning a new year over again. But Jesus has to tell these hard-headed friends of his, I'm not talking about that yeast that Becky throws into her flour and oil and water. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the yeast of these Pharisees and scribes. How it is that they, through their words and actions, they're sort of like throwing things into the flour and causing it to do some crazy things. Beware these Pharisees. Because what I'm giving you is like, it's like I'm giving you the flour and the water and the oil right here. Here's what I'm giving you for your nourishment. And they're coming along and they're throwing in this magical powder that's changing it. So there was something in the ancient mind about this yeast where Jesus is comparing it to something evil. And remember the Jews, they swept their houses of this evil once a year during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Any thoughts as we hear these words? Go stepping back in time 2,000 years when we didn't understand things like yeast. Shoot. Becky is magic.
Becky.
Where does that bring us up to? Where do we leave off at? What was that?
Peter declares.
Peter declares that.
And who are we up to? Vincent? So Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah. For those following on Facebook, this is Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah. Take it away, Vincent.
When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea in Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "What do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will bound in heaven. And whatever you lose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah.
So this is Matthew chapter 16, famous verse. Matthew chapter 16, 15 is when Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" He's walking with his friends. "Hey, who do the people say that I am? I'd love to know. Let me in on the gossip. What's the cheese man? What are people saying about me?" They will say, "Some people think that you're John the Baptist. Oh, other people think that you're Elijah, come back from the dead. Oh, they think that you're one of the prophets." Jesus looks at them and says, "Okay, thanks for the cheese man. Who do you say that I am?" Matthew chapter 16, verse 15. Well, perhaps one of the most famous verses of Matthew is Matthew 16:16, where Peter gives his answer. And what does Peter say? "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Peter's confession of faith. Peter was the one who recognized there was something special about this guy. You are the Messiah, the Christ, the one that people have been waiting for. Bishop Michelangelo D'Arrigo, in this month's issue of Extraordinary Catholics magazine, writes of this story. He calls it the terrible threes, Rocky. Where does he get this whole Rocky thing from? Jesus says, "You are Peter." Peter was a Greek word meaning petrified. What does it mean to be petrified? Petrified, you're so scared that you turn into stone. Right? You see Medusa and the snakes in her hair and you're so afraid, and you turn into stone. You're petrified. Peter, you are rock. This is where there becomes a double entendre. Peter, Simon, your name is Simon, but from now on you're going to get a new name, a new nickname, and that is Peter, or what I like to say, Rocky, which is why Bishop Michelangelo in his article talks about the terrible threes, Rocky, right? You, Simon, from now on I'm going to call you Rocky. And on this rock, on this rock, my church will be built. Now is Jesus talking about, on you, Peter, I'm going to build my church, which is the Roman Catholic Church says when they justify, when they build on Peter, and Peter's successor is the Pope. I don't know how they got to that. I do know how they got to that. It's not logic we want to follow for tonight. Or, as Bishop Michelangelo points out in his article, was Jesus talking about this place where they were located? Where does it say that this story is taking place at? In verse 13, in the region of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi. What's so special about that? Biblical scholars look at this and they figured out that there's this, it just had this stench. Have you ever smelled sulfur before? It smells like rotten eggs, sulfur. And there's a place in Caesarea Philippi where just like the sulfur belches out of the earth. And you can be walking by and, out comes some sulfur and like, oh, was that you, Mario? It smells so terrible, right? It smells so terrible. And so they referred to this place as the gates of hell. If there's an entrance to hell anywhere on this earth, then that must be, that must be it. And of all the places in Jesus' travels, for him to say that he's going to build the church, here they are at the gates of hell. Oh, dang, that sulfur is just really strong. Can anyone else smell it? It just drives me crazy. Jesus says, I'm going to build my church, and not even the stench of that sulfur is going to come near it. It's going to have any place in this kingdom. This kingdom, this church that we're building is going to be stronger than anything on this earth, including the place that they call the gates of hell, that sulfur pit.
Father Jamie, was Peter crucified with his head down in Rome?
I don't know, I wasn't there, but according to the tradition of the
That's
church,
what the guy told us.
according to the tradition of the church, when Peter was getting ready, when they were getting ready to crucify Peter, he said, "Oh no, you can't do that to me. That's what they did to Jesus. Let's switch it up a little. Maybe you could do like crucify me upside down." Okay, whatever you want. And so they crucified him upside down, according to the tradition of the church. He was not worthy to die the same death as his Lord. I wasn't there, but it's a good story. I love the story.
It's the Romans, right?
Yeah, sure. If you want to be crucified upside down, we can crucify you upside down. Hey guys, let's crucify him upside down. Vincent?
I just like the part where he says, the Son of the living God. Because I can imagine at that time, there were other people that were worshiping other, idols or whatever, like the calf or whatever, but they weren't really real. They were just statues. And he says the living God, which, Moses saw the burning bush. And then everything else.
It's not some God of the past. You're the Son of the living God. You're God's Son.
It says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." Is this the Jonah with the whale?
This is not the Jonah of the whale, but it would have been a popular name. So many translations translate it as John. Peter, son of John. So more than anything, it's a question of translation. John, Jonah. Peter, son of John, Peter, son of Jonah. Remember, back then we didn't have last names, which is why Jesus doesn't have a last name. Christ is not his last name. And the way that we referred to one another, as men, of course, remember this is a patriarchal society, was referred to ourselves by our father's name, right? So it was Jamie, son of David. Oh, that Jamie. Jesus, son of Joseph. Oh, that Jesus. Okay, I think I know who you're talking about. The one from Nazareth? Yeah, okay. Right, for Jesus to predict his death. Now it becomes interesting because now that we have this insight, you are the Son of God, then where does the conversation go? Jesus predicts his death. Coming back to Deacon Stephen, this is chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. Jesus predicts his death.
From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day, and on the third day he must be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom."
So we round out chapter 16, this famous chapter with, "Who do you say that I am?" Hey, Peter, you are the Son of the living God. You are the Messiah, the Christ. Oh, you're right, Peter. But do you know what that means? That means that I'm going to have to suffer and die. And Peter says, "Oh, wait a minute. No. You're the Messiah. The Messiah's like going to come in and rule and overturn the empire, right?" Jesus is talking about how it is that Jesus is going to suffer and die. Of course, Matthew knew how the story was going to turn out. Jesus suffered and died. And the lesson for those Christians who were now suffering and dying, being persecuted, was Jesus suffered and died. And you know what? You might expect a little suffering as well. Jesus himself said, "Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me." Follow him to the cross. Because God raised Jesus up, and I've got news for you. If God raised Jesus up, what does that mean for you? Even though the lion eats you in the middle of the arena, God is going to raise you up. You can take up your cross, you can suffer, and God is going to redeem that suffering. I love it. Here in this chapter 16, Peter has this great insight, and then a few sentences later, Jesus says, what to him? Get behind me, Satan. Shoot. Why does Jesus call him that? Because Peter does not recognize, doesn't have the eyes to see that Jesus is going to suffer and die. And that's the way it is for those of us who follow Jesus. There may be some suffering. Pope John Paul II was famous for this because he really suffered in a very public way. Remember when he got Alzheimer's and he was really, bent over? By the time that I went to see him in Mexico on July the 31st of 2002, I mean, he couldn't even sit up straight. His mitre was literally like horizontal to the floor. He was just like sitting in the chair like this. But he always said that he was uniting his suffering with the sufferings of Christ. Jesus suffered, so he was not going to quit being a pope. He was not going to resign. He was going to be a model of suffering. And show people that, you know what? Jesus suffered and all of us are going to suffer too, but there's something on the other side of it. Suffering is not the end. I'm not going to quit and go off and suffer and die alone. No. I'm going to soldier on as an example of suffering. Shoot. Ready for chapter 17? Jordan, this brings us to chapter 17, verses 1 through 13, the Transfiguration. We just prayed the Rosary, and we talked about the Transfiguration. Here's Matthew's story, the Transfiguration, chapter 17.
After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The disciples asked him, Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist.
Chapter 17, now the Transfiguration. We've all heard the story before. We hear it every year on the second Sunday of Lent. How Jesus took 3 friends, Peter, James, and John. Where's Andrew? Wasn't he one of the first? I don't know where he was. Peter, James, and John took those, symbolic number 3, took those 3 friends with him up the mountain closer to God, where he was transfigured, transformed in their sight. His clothes became dazzlingly white. It was just like brilliant light. It was a foreshadow of Jesus in his glory. He appeared with Moses and Elijah. Why is that important? Moses summed up the law. Elijah was a prophet. Jesus was now greater than the law and the prophets. Peter says, Lord, let us set up 3 tents. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. 3 tents, meaning they were going to sleep there, they were going to camp there that night? No, that's not what he was talking about. Back in the ancient time, you set up a tent so that no one would step on that space. Moses was just standing here. Oh. We don't want people just to walk over. Heather, no, Heather, don't walk here. How are we going to keep people from walking here? Oh, let's set up a tent. And then when people go to that tent, they're going to be like, what's that tent there for? Let me tell you what that tent's there for. Moses appeared there. You can't just walk over that grass as if it's just ordinary grass. It's holy land. This is my son. Listen to him. The voice coming down from the cloud. Of course, God confirming that this is God's son. We have that element of secret again. Don't tell anyone. God loves that ending. Elijah. Elijah has already come. Who was Elijah? Do you remember the story of Elijah? Who is Elijah? Elijah was the one who was so holy at the end of his life he didn't die. Instead, what happened? Flaming chariot comes down from heaven. He steps onto the flaming chariot. Giddy up! And he rides off into heaven. The question was, when Elijah went up to heaven, has Elijah ever come back? Jesus said Elijah has come back in the form of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was Elijah come back from the dead, according to the story told by Matthew. Is that as good a place as any? Is it the 9 o'clock hour already?
9:03.
9:03? Awesome. We'll pick up then on chapter 17, verse 14. When we come back, we are going line by line through the Gospel of Matthew. Shall we end with the prayer? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, as now, and forever shall be, a world without end. Amen.